Hello, dear learners. Welcome to the first video session of the MOOC titled Rural Development in India. In this session, we shall discuss the first unit of Module 1, which is titled as Understanding Rural Society. Here in this video, we shall try to discuss the concept of rural society, the distinct characteristics of rural society, and how rural society is different from urban society. In addition, we shall also try to understand the rural-urban interdependence, the concept of rural-urban continuum, so on and so forth. So, dear learners, let us first discuss the concept of rural society. So when we say or when we use the term rural, it suggests many things or many different things to different people. For example, it may mean agricultural landscape to someone or isolation to someone else, small towns, low population density, so on and so forth. So the term rural implies a kind of an agricultural landscape, and it also implies a kind of isolation or remoteness, so on and so forth. So when we use this term, it may imply or we might get a different picture for different people. But in simple terms, if we have to define rural society, the term rural society refers to social formations that are primarily characterized by agrarian mode of production. It also implies the societies which have traditional value systems and close-knit social relations. Therefore, in simplest sense, rural society represents the way of life in villages and countryside areas where people live in close connection with nature, land, and community. So, rural simply means a society which is in contrast to the urban society. Rural implies a kind of society which is agriculture or agrarian based. It implies a society where relationships are more closely connected, where family, kinship, all these bonds are very, very important, and where you find a kind of homogeneity. So to understand, these are the simple ways in which we can understand a rural society. Different scholars have defined rural society in different ways. According to Kingsley Davis, rural society is a society in which the primary occupation of people is cultivation and where people live in small scattered settlements. Similarly, A.R. Desai, another renowned scholar, has defined rural society as an agrarian social structure which is shaped by land relations, caste hierarchies, and traditional authority. The father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, believed that India's soul resided or lived in its villages. He viewed village as the foundation of Indian civilization, and according to him, a village represents simplicity, moral purity, and community harmony. Values he felt were being eroded by urbanization and industrial modernity. So, we have seen how different scholars define rural society, and the commonality of these definitions is that the population of rural society is small, usually small, and they are mainly agriculture dependent. They live in close connection with nature, and people in the village, they share a close bond or a close tie. From these definitions, it may appear to us that rural society is something static, rural society is something, stagnant, but it is not so. Dear learners, rural society cannot be seen as static. It has not remained same all throughout the generations. Rather, it has also undergone massive transformations due to the influence of various socio-cultural, economic, and political factors. Many contemporary thinkers are of the opinion that these transformations are due to the influence of modernization, westernization, industrialization, and also globalization. Thinkers like Daniel Thorner, D.N. Dhanagare, who have worked extensively on Indian rural society, Indian agrarian societies, argues that the penetration of market forces, technological changes, and states' interventions or states' initiatives have restructured the traditional rural society, the traditional rural relations, and this has created a some kind of a rural urban kind of a hybrid society. So we have seen, or there are thinkers who argue that rural society has also undergone transformations over the period, and it has imbibed the traits of urban society, and it is not something very distinct from the urban society, but then we will discuss how it is also interdependent upon urban society, or how there is an interdependence between rural society and urban society. But then rural society is not static. It has transformed over the period of time, and it has been influenced by various socio-cultural factors, and it has also imbibed traits of urban societies and urban ways of life. Therefore, rural society cannot be merely seen as backward, remote, static entity. Rather, it is a complex social system where we see the coexistence of both tradition and modernity, where tradition and change coexist. It embodies deep-rooted cultural values and communal solidarity, while also being influenced by modern economic and political processes. The study of rural society therefore helps us to understand not only the foundation of rural social life in agrarian settings, but also the broader processes of social change that affect the entire rural society at large. So, dear learners, we have learned that rural society is not a static entity. Secondly, although policymakers, researchers, and scholars prefer one standardized all purpose definition of rural, but actually, the term rural is a multifaceted concept. Rural is again not very homogeneous. The characteristics that we will discuss will see that rural societies share certain common traits, they share certain similarities, but there is variations among rural societies also. There exist variations in terms of demography, in terms of economic profile, in terms of culture, environmental characteristics, social practices, so on and so forth. So, rural societies across the country, across India, or across the world, they share certain commonalities, no doubt about it, but we also see great variations among rural societies as well. Nevertheless, there are certain characteristics which the rural areas share in common. Let us discuss some of them. The first characteristic of rural society, or the first feature of rural society that comes to our mind when we talk about, when we hear the term rural, is an agrarian economy. Majority of the population in rural society are engaged in cultivation, livestock rearing, and other allied agricultural activities. So, the economy in a rural society is agrarian in nature. Secondly, there is a close-knit social bond or social relation among people living in the rural societies. Social life is organized around family, kinship, community ties, and people know each other personally. Caste and family comprise the core social institutions in rural society. And the relationship between people in rural societies are largely informal. Everyone, they know each other and they share a very, very close relationship. So it is mostly informal kind of a relationship. The third characteristic of rural society is that it has its own traditional and cultural values. Custom, religion, and traditions play a very central, a very significant role in the daily life and practices and decision making processes in rural areas. Another characteristic which rural societies have is limited infrastructure. Access to modern amenities such as good healthcare facilities, educational institutions, and transportation is often limited as compared to urban societies. The fifth characteristic that comes to our mind regarding rural society is slow social change. A few minutes before, we have said that rural societies have also undergone changes, it has also undergone transformations. But, dear learners, this change is very, very slow and gradual in nature. Social mobility and social change occur at a very, very slower pace in rural societies, unlike the urban counterparts, and there is still a strong emphasis on continuity and tradition. The last characteristic of rural society is collective life. So, cooperation and mutual aid are valued. Community decisions are made through village councils and informal gatherings. So, the life in the village is very, very collective, cooperative, and major decisions in the village are taken by the community as a whole. They have their own community leaders, they have their village councils which govern the functioning of the village. So it embodies a collective kind of a life. So, dear learners, these are the distinct characteristics of a rural society. So, dear learners, we have discussed about the characteristics of rural society, and now let us understand in what ways is rural society different from an urban society. The distinction between rural and urban societies is one of the oldest and most fundamental differences or distinctions of human society. It represents two contrasting ways of life, one based on tradition, community centered living, and the other based on modern, individualistic, and an industrial kind of living. Scholars like Ferdinand Tönnies, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and and Louis Ritz have all analyzed how social relationships, occupations, and values differ between rural and urban worlds. So let us now try to understand the difference between rural and urban society from the perspective of these scholars. Ferdinand Tönnies used the term Gemeinschaft to characterize or to define a rural society. Gemeinschaft, which also means community, is a typical of rural life which is marked by close personal relationships, kinship ties, and emotional bonds. While he uses the term Gesellschaft or society for an urban society. So he uses the term Gemeinschaft for characterizing or defining rural society, and Gesellschaft on the other hand to characterize or define or typify an urban society. Gesellschaft, which is typical of an urban life, is marked by impersonal, contractual, and formal relations. So, between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, we have seen that in Gemeinschaft there is people are more closely connected. They have more personal kind of connection or bonding. While in Gesellschaft or urban society, which is typical of urban society, here the relations are more formal, more contractual, or more impersonal. So, according to Tones, rural society is intimate and moral, while urban society is very, very rational and individualistic. Now, coming to Emile Durkheim, Durkheim viewed rural societies as characterized by mechanical solidarity, where social cohesion comes from shared beliefs, values, and similarities among members, whereas urban societies are based on organic solidarity, where cohesion arises from interdependence and specialization in work. So, this is how, based on solidarity, Durkheim distinguished rural and urban society. Now, coming to Louis Ritz, he argued that urban life produces a distinct kind of a social psychology which comprises of anonymity, impersonality, and individualism. He identified population size, density, and heterogeneity as factors shaping the urban way of life. So, while defining urban society, uh, Louis Ritz, in his famous essay Urbanism as a Way of Life, mentioned about these characteristics like anonymity, impersonality, individualism as characteristics of urban society. So, from these perspectives or these concepts given by these thinkers, we can get an idea of the distinction between rural and urban society. Let us discuss the differences more elaborately. The first major difference between rural and urban society is population density. In rural areas, we have small, scattered, and low density population, while in urban areas, the population density is large, it is huge, it is dense and concentrated. The second difference is on the basis of occupation, where in the rural areas we have people predominantly, dominating or predominantly having agriculture as their occupation, and in urban societies we see people engaged more in industry and commerce and other service sectors. Then, coming to social relations, we see that in rural societies, the social relations are more personal, intimate, and kin based. There are informal rules or customs that govern the social relations. Whereas in urban societies, the relations are more impersonal, formal, and contract based. And here there are formal rules, to govern the relations. And following from this, we can understand that the nature of social control is also different in rural and urban societies, because rural societies, the relations are more personal and intimate. Here customs and religion and community norms, etc., play a strong role in social control. The informal mechanisms of social control play a significant role in controlling the rural society. But while coming to urban society, because here people do not know each other, the relationships are impersonal, so here we have formal rules and regulations, we have laws, we have police, so on and so forth, to maintain social order and social control. Now, coming to social mobility. In rural societies, social mobility is very, very limited. Social mobility means change in a person's social status. In rural society, the social status is usually caste based, which a person gains at the time of his birth, so which is very difficult to change. People cannot change their caste status, so social mobility is very, very limited or restricted. But in urban society, the status is basically defined by class, and it is comparatively easier to change class status because this status is achieved through education and income, and any person who gets who achieves higher qualification and good jobs or reputed jobs can change his class status. So, social mobility is restricted in rural societies, and in urban societies, it is, more flexible, more open. Then, coming to social change, we have also already discussed that though social changes have taken place, but in rural society, we see a slower kind of social change, and in urban society, the social change is rapid, and it takes place at a faster pace. Then coming to family structure, we see joint families or extended families in rural societies mostly, but in urban societies we see more, nuclear kind of families. And coming to social solidarity, we have already discussed that, in rural societies, solidarity is based on similarity or shared values. They have mechanical solidarity, but in urban society, solidarity is based on specialization and interdependence. So they have organic solidarity. So these are the major differences between rural and urban societies. But dear learners, though rural and urban societies have distinctive features, yet they are not completely separate or isolated entities. There are interminglings or interdependencies between rural society and urban society. It is in this context thinkers like Robert Redfield introduced the idea of rural-urban continuum, arguing that rural and urban societies are not completely distinct but exist along a spectrum. Robert Redfield's studies of Mexican villages showed how traditional and modern values coexisted, and this illustrates that rural and urban traits intermingle due to migration, modernization, and communication. So, though there is always a tendency, or we always often see rural in total contrast to urban areas, but then that is always not true. Rural areas have imbibed the characteristics of at least certain characteristics or traits of urban societies because of migration, modernization, then communication between rural and urban societies. So rural societies have imbibed this kind of urban traits. So, though rural urban distinction represents more than a geographical division, it is a contrast between two social orders and value systems. But in the modern era of globalization and fast paced communication, these differences are increasingly becoming blurred, giving rise to more hybrid forms of living that combine elements of both rural and urban societies. Thus, the relationship between rural and urban areas is not one of isolation or opposition, but there is mutual dependence and complementarity. While rural areas are traditionally seen as centers of agriculture, primary production, traditional culture, so on and so forth, urban areas are hubs of industry, trade, administration, and innovation. But despite these differences, neither rural society or urban society can exist or prosper in isolation. So there has to be mutual dependence and mutual interdependence between rural and urban society, and therefore thinkers and scholars argue that rural and urban societies are deeply interlinked economically, socially, and environmentally. So, dear learners, by now we all must have understood that though rural societies have its own distinct characteristics which are in contrast or which are in opposite to the urban societies, yet rural and urban societies are not completely poles apart or not completely distinct, but there is a kind of rural urban interdependence, and rural societies have also imbibed the traits, imbibed certain features of urban societies. Now, it is in this context that we are going to discuss another very important aspect, that is rural urban interdependence. Rural urban interdependence refers to the reciprocal and complementary relationship between the countryside and the cities, where each provides goods, services, resources and human capital that the other needs. In simple words, rural areas supply food, raw materials, labor, and cultural heritage to the cities, while urban areas provide markets, manufactured goods, technology, education, and employment opportunities to the rural population. However, this relationship between rural and urban is not always exploitative. It is mutually constitutive. In terms of raw materials, agricultural food production, urban market depends on rural areas, while in turn, for manufactured goods and services, rural society depends on the urban center or urban markets. Thus, the growth and well-being of one directly affects the other. Though we say that this relation between rural and urban is not always exploitative, but many thinkers argue that these exchanges between rural and urban are typically unequal, leading to rural underdevelopment and urban centric growth. Studies have revealed that urban centers accumulate profits through adding high value of raw materials in urban market, helping in the growth of financial capital in the urban areas, while rural producers often remain trapped in low income cycles, reinforcing the structural dependency on urban centers and markets. Thus, for many thinkers and as per many studies, this rural urban interdependence reflects a persistent asymmetry that underpins spatial and economic inequalities in developing economies. So, dear learners, we have discussed about rural and urban interdependence. Now, let us talk about Indian rural population, or in brief about the rural population in India. We have already discussed about the definitions in the beginning of this session. Let us discuss in brief about how census defines the rural. The census defines all places with a municipality, corporation, cantonment board or a notified town area committee, etc., as urban, and places which do not fulfill these or do not have these are classified as rural. The total population of India spreads over more than 6,40,867 villages and 7,935 towns. And therefore, because there are huge numbers of villages in India, it is called as a country of villages. Even today, about 69% of the total population of India lives in the villages. But the proportion of rural population has been decreasing in its successive censuses. This is very important because what we have seen is the proportion of urban population in the total population has been increasing slowly and steadily, and this is evident from the census data. In 1951, the percentage of population living in rural areas in India was 82.7%, and in urban areas it was 17.3%. But in 2011, the percentage of population residing in rural areas has gone down to 68.8%, and that of urban areas has increased to 31.2%. The growth in urban population is significantly higher at 31.8%, and that of growth of rural population is 12.18% during 2001 to 11. So much of these population growth in urban areas is due to the rapid migration of people from rural to urban areas. When we discuss the subsequent modules on demography, on rural economy, we'll be able to understand more of these, of why urban population is increasing, why there is migration from rural to urban areas, or why there is rapid rural migration, so on and so forth. But here we have just given the gist of the scenario of rural society as per census data. So, 2011 census also reveals that still, though there is a decrease in the rural population or percentage of people living in the rural areas, but there are still huge section of the population residing in the rural areas, and therefore rural development is a very, very pertinent issue. Rural development is important for a balanced, inclusive, and sustainable growth in the country. Rural development is crucial because it helps to reduce poverty and inequality. It helps in improving the quality of life, in improving agricultural productivity, in creating or generating employment opportunities, in ensuring food security, providing social stability, and also encouraging sustainable development. So rural development is very, very crucial, not only for the rural societies but also for the larger nation. So, therefore, we can say that rural development is needed to address the socio-economic issues confronting the rural society, to improve the living conditions of the rural population, and for their overall social well-being. And therefore, as students and members of civil society, it is very important, or it is very pertinent, to study rural development, to understand the current state of rural societies, their problems, policies and programs undertaken for the benefit and welfare of rural population, so on and so forth. So studying rural development is very, very pertinent for any member of the society. And studying rural development would help us understand the dynamics of socio-economic transformations in rural areas. It would provide us with analytical frameworks to understand and address the issues of poverty, inequality, and resource management, thereby fostering inclusive and sustainable development. So from this perspective, it is we all can understand that studying rural development is very, very pertinent, very, very important in the present day context. And therefore, we thank you all for joining this course, and in the subsequent modules, we shall delve deeper into understanding rural society and rural development. With these words, I conclude here today, and best wishes to all of you. Thank you.